Okay, so now we're looking at how the conditions that how people of color got really segregated into America in terms of housing and where they lived, and they're pushed into certain areas that resulted in terms that we kind of use today, like ghetto, to describe the areas and horrible conditions that people of color live in parts of the United States, and the poverty was really concentrated, which resulted in other things like the quality of the education, the money for schools not being as much, and decreases there. So we're going to look at some key policies that really the government itself implemented into America that really caused a lot of these issues. The first is they created what's called the Federal Housing Administration. The Federal Housing Administration, and you guys might have, you'll hear this term FHA, especially when you want to buy a house or you want to or buy a condo or a townhouse or something. When you get older, a lot of people know what an FHA is because they'll talk about what's called the FHA loan. And when you're a new homeowner, the federal government might provide you with a much better loan than what's called a conventional loan to buy a house. So if you buy an FHA loan, you might get less interest in your house. You might have a better, cheaper loan than if you get what's called a conventional loan. It's not always that way. Conventional can be better sometimes, which is just through the banking system. But the government will subsidize housing prices and loans and back you up, especially as a new house owner, because you're kind of risky. Because if you've never bought a house before, we don't necessarily know if you're going to make your payments or go bankrupt or stop paying your house. So under these FHA loans, they start creating these guidelines that really favored white Americans in the county. So redlining was when banks would give loans for people to buy houses in neighborhoods of people of the same race. So the first thing that kind of happened as a result of what's called these FHA loans are redlining. So you can see the map. This is St. Louis, and this is a pretty recent map of population distribution, and it's kind of hard to see. But the white dots represent white Americans and where they're concentrated in St. Louis. Black dots represent African Americans. Red dots show a decrease of white Americans, and orange dots show an increase of African Americans. And you could see that the decreases are kind of in downtown St. Louis. It's kind of hard to see. And then you can see African Americans are very much concentrated in northern parts of St. Louis City, and it kind of goes out to the county. And then there's even parts of the county where there's a higher concentration of African Americans. And a lot of this is due, and especially go to East St. Louis, you can see there's a heavy concentration on East St. Louis side of African Americans. It has to do with redlining. So that line around the half circle is the county line. And the county is where you could buy houses that were cheap, new. You got a new stove, air conditioner, and you get these cookie cutter houses that are really a result of what's called Levitt towns and Bill Levett's invention. So if you ever go out to Florissant, that's a really good place where you'll see a lot of these Levitt townhouses. You've probably seen them. They're kind of like a rectangle. They're probably not the best looking house on the outside, and then it has like a cover for the car, and that people later would turn that in the garages and so forth and so on. But these houses at the time were a big deal because people could buy a house, and that wasn't the case until then. So you could buy a house cheap for almost no money down with these FHA loans. The only issue was if you were white, you basically got the loan. If you're a person of color, if you're Latinx or African American or Asian American, you're probably not getting the loan. And we're going to find out why. Because of this redlining system where the federal government drew up these boundaries, and they would show that if an area was predominantly people of color, that would actually bring the housing values down. So if you wanted to get a loan in a neighborhood of people of color, it would be harder to get a loan, and especially unless you were like a person of color, and even then it was hard to get a loan because African Americans and people of color didn't really get loans very well. They were a very small percentage. Something like 2% of the actual loans in America were people of color until the 1960s. I mean, it was just absolutely absurd that 98% of loans went to white people. And you have to understand the power of owning a house. If you own a house in a nice neighborhood, that is one of the best ways of generate what's called generational wealth, where you pass down your wealth. If your parents own a nice house in a nice school district, then they give the house to you and they pass on. Or if they sell the house, they make a lot of money and they give it to you when you, if they pass away, you'll inherit it. And then you could buy a house in a nice area with a good education and so forth and so on. So you're making sure that your family's children keep getting a good education and live in a safe and nice community. Well, this really benefited white Americans. And just up until recently, things haven't changed much. And people are still getting, there's still people that are stuck. They may own a house, but they may own a house in an area where the schools, they don't have a lot of money for the school district and the education quality is not as invested in. And the houses themselves, they can't sell. So I'll give you an example. You look at like Clayton, Missouri. Clayton's just right outside of St. Louis where we live. Clayton is one of the wealthiest, most expensive places to buy a house in America, honestly. So if you inherited a house, and I've had friends that their parents were teachers, 30, 40 years ago, they bought a house in Clayton and they sold their house today. You just have a small house in Clayton, you could probably make $400,000, $500,000 for a house. Now, that same house, if you inherit it, if you're African American in North St. Louis, for example, that house might be worth, and I'm not joking, my friend is a loan officer, and he's told me that houses in North St. Louis will go for $20,000. Less than that. I've heard of people buying houses for $5,000 in North St. Louis. That's cheaper than a car. So those people didn't inherit hardly any wealth. They have the house, but then the house itself you can't sell, and if you do, you don't make hardly any money, or it's hard to rent out. Now, once a person of color actually bought the house in a neighborhood of people of color, the banks would not lend them any money to fix or keep the house up. So if you guys understand that if you have a house in a nice neighborhood, what happens is your values go up and you actually get equity in your house, which means like investment money into your house. And then you can borrow money against the equity in your house to actually reinvest in your house. So a lot of things go wrong with houses. First of all, roofs. Roofs can go wrong. Air conditioners can go break down. Heaters, all that stuff's like thousands of dollars. I mean, if your roof goes bad, that could easily be $5, $10, $15,000 to replace a roof. If you don't have money to replace a roof, you're in trouble because the roof will start leaking and destroying your house. And I'm sure all your parents will tell you, and everybody owns a house, is that one of the worst things that happens to the house is water damage. It's just absolutely devastating. You get water in the basement, you can get things like mold, people get sick, the air quality's bad. You have a lot of issues. You cannot mess around with water damage. So that's why it's so important to maintain and keep a nice roof and keep the house running and clean and nice so that everything is safe. So that's why you have to understand that these houses start getting decrepit. So now you had neighborhoods of people of color, and they literally, nobody wanted to buy the houses, and the houses themselves lost value, and then you couldn't borrow money to actually fix your house. It's really entrapping people of color in these neighborhoods. So here's a Redline map, and you can see the map itself. So the red areas are predominantly African American. This is St. Louis and St. Louis County, parts of it, not all of it. And you can see where it's red, right on the riverfront by the factories. That's usually cheap. The cheapest real estate around is right next to factories because of the pollution. And then you can see green is good. Green is the real good stuff. So if you had a lot of money, you want to live in a green neighborhood. And what would happen is you would want to buy in the green neighborhood. So you can see green is just west of, there's Forest Park is that big area. That's why it's got no design. And blue meant that the neighborhood was, and yellow, the neighborhoods are getting more integrated. So they're changing. So the safest place to buy would be in a white neighborhood. And if you didn't, your neighborhoods, the value of your house could go down. And people would know this stuff. So let's see. Do you see how there's Forest Park? Is that big chunk in the middle of land? You go to the west, that's Clayton. You go south of there, there's Dogtown. You see the city's become a little bit more diverse. But then you go all the way down to South City in the St. Louis Hills, it's green. Still today, it's very white. I think this map, while it might be very old, is actually probably still pretty accurate today. You can see that the neighborhoods are less diverse on the county as well. And as things change, this concentrated people more and more and created this system. And it wasn't just in St. Louis, it's all across America. Chicago is considered the most segregated city of the United States, and a lot of that is due to these systems. But New York, Los Angeles, they all had these systems. So we watched it in class. Now we can see there's Philadelphia, and you can see some of the consequences today. Now the other thing was social steering. Social steering was when real estate agents would only try to sell houses to people in the areas of their house. So with redlining, you have to understand you would go to the bank, you wouldn't necessarily know about this system. Like this whole system was everybody knew about it in the banking system, but most people who worked in banks were white. So if a person of color would go to the bank and they'd say, "Hey, I'd like to take out a loan. I want to buy a house in Ladue or Clayton or in this area," and they'd be like, they come back like, "I'm sorry, the loan just wouldn't go through." But you could be a professional African American. You could be like a doctor or a dentist or a lawyer, and you could be like, "No, no, no, I have enough money. My credit's good. I should be able to buy a house there." "I'm sorry, sir, the loan won't go through." And then magically, you try to buy a house in what was considered the professional black neighborhood in St. Louis. You guys know where that is? The Ville, which was Sumner High School. That's why Sumner had some famous people like Ike Turner, Tina Turner, Dick Gregory, Arthur Ashe, the famous tennis player. All of them went to Sumner High School because that's a lot of wealthy African Americans. They grew up in the Ville neighborhood. You bought in the Ville, that's okay. Your loan might go through, but only 2% of African Americans or of American loans were African American, and that's over years and years of buying houses. Now, social steering, as you could see, is you would go with a real estate agent and they would steer you to white and black neighborhoods or Latinx neighborhoods. So if you wanted to buy like I'd like to look at some houses in Chesterfield, they would take you. They'd be like, no, 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 that area's just not right. Let's go look at North St. Louis and let's look at the Ville area or something like that. They would take you to different parts of the St. Louis City, and they would only show you based on your race where you're supposed to go. And that was the real estate agents were doing that and selling houses and pushing you certain ways. And there were laws that reinforced this as well. You can see it less than 25%. You can see even Philadelphia today. Look how concentrated people of color and how white people are kind of still segregated. Most of the areas are either mostly white or mostly people of color. Areas that are more diverse are not as many. It's getting better, but not as many. So what's interesting about St. Louis is probably the famous case that really ends, as the beginning of the end of redlining, starts in St. Louis, Missouri. And the house is still there. It's 4600 Labadie. And you could go in there. I don't know if you can do it right now, but with the pandemic, but if you get a tour guide, they'll take you. You can call up and they'll take you on a view of the house. This is the famous Kramer house. So in the St. Louis, Missouri, or the Shelley house, I'm sorry, the Shelley versus Kramer outlawed racial covenants on real estate. It really changes everything in St. Louis. St. Louis is the beginning of the end of this. So what happens is the Shelley family, they save up really a lot of money. Their father worked really, really hard. He moved in St. Louis from the South, I believe. And they worked really hard, and he wanted to buy this house, the Kramer house, which is in North St. Louis, but it was in a restricted area. And the house said, in the covenants, which is the laws of the house, the guy who owned the house said, "I'm not going to sell it," or in that neighborhood, the covenants was that you couldn't buy a house if you're a person of color in that neighborhood of North St. Louis. It's right next to Colt Brilliant Presbyterian Church, if you guys know where that is. And so the Shelley family tried to buy the house, and they said, "No, you cannot buy the house. You cannot buy it at all." And the Kramers are like, "Why?" And well, they have a racial covenants. And a covenant is a written rules or restrictions on who can buy the house based on race. And the Shelley family didn't they like, "I really want to buy this house." Well, the guy that owned the house actually said, "Look, I don't care who I sell the house to." But the guy right down the street, Kramer, said, "No, no, no. Black people can't live in this neighborhood." And so they sued him. They sued to buy the house, and they won. They won, and it said that the government said that the court said that you cannot, racial covenants are not allowed. These rules cannot happen on housing. You can't put in, "I won't sell to somebody based on their race." And this is actually before many other desegregation programs in the United States. And this kind of puts an end to it all, which is really neat. And it happened in St. Louis. You should go check out Shelley versus Kramer. And that's what leads to these ideas that, and we're not going to go too much into this, that, that African Americans start using this term to refer to their neighborhoods as ghettos. And that was not to talk about the horrible conditions that Jewish people were treated. And in Detroit, they really did build walls around the black neighborhoods of Detroit. And what happened as a result of the building the walls, they could not, they couldn't believe it. But what happened is the property values on the white side of the wall went up, and the black neighborhoods values stayed the same or went down. And that's why in Detroit, there's these walls around what's called the 9 Mile street. So it just blows your mind. Could you imagine being African American? These guys and girls they would leave your neighborhood and they would say it's just like a Jewish ghetto. Like you can't leave the Jewish ghetto if you're Jewish. Well, if you're African American, if you leave a black neighborhood at nighttime, as soon as you enter a white neighborhood, woo, the police pull you over. Yeah, there's no official you can't leave your neighborhood, but I think a lot of people of color would say, if you're in the wrong neighborhood, meaning like a white area at nighttime, the police are going to pull you over and just try to figure out what you're doing. And they said that we're trapped in here like a ghetto, like a Jewish ghetto. And it was actually African Americans using that term to describe the horrible conditions they were treated. And you can remember we talked about the Holocaust. So I want you to understand that concept. And you can see today the consequences of redlining and social steering is these neighborhoods some of these neighborhoods are just falling apart in cities. And white people moved out to the county and bought brand new houses, and their property values went up. They had more money for schools in their neighborhoods, and the urban areas in the cities where the white people it's called white flight, they had left for cheap housing in the counties, it had all fallen apart. And you have to understand that really Bill Levitt and Levittowns accelerate the whole thing. So what a Levittown is that Bill Levitt, during World War II, he started creating this system of look, Henry Ford made the assembly line, which we put parts together on a line, and then we could build a car. And Henry Ford could build hundreds of thousands of cars super fast. Bill Levitt says, well, what if you do the reverse? If you do the reverse, you could apply that to building buildings or houses. And he did. So what he did is he realized that, look, I can get cheap labor. I don't need a carpenter that could do all kinds of stuff. I just need guys that can put up walls. I need a team of guys that can put pipes in the ground. People that can put the foundation. What I'll do is I'll have the foundation guys come in, then move next door and do the foundation, and then next door and move the foundation. And then I'll have the pipe fitters and the plumbers come in and lay the pipes. And then the carpenters will lay the walls. And he would have these teams. And at the time, it would take something like maybe 3 months to just build a house. Well, Bill Levitt, and this is after World War II, he could build something like 30 houses a day. And he just got more and more money, and he could build more and more houses, and he could put up these neighborhoods super fast. And that's actually how we build houses today. If you look out at subdivisions, they have like maybe 2 or 3 models of house that your parents or you could pick from, and then they'll build the house, and they can build them really fast because they've got a layout, and it's just going to be set the same way every time. And that's called the Levittowns. The first one was outside of New York. But Bill Levitt is an interesting guy. He's actually Jewish American, but he did not want people of color to ever live in his houses. So he would write it into the racial covenants, and they couldn't buy Levitt houses, which were cheap. After World War II, you could get a Levitt house for $4,000, maybe in like Florissant, Missouri or something like that. Or even by West Mid-County, like Brentwood or something, they have some Levitt towns. You can see them all around St. Louis, actually, 50s and early 50s, 60s built houses. And African Americans couldn't buy any of these houses. People of color couldn't buy these houses. They got completely priced out. And that built a lot of white Americans' wealth. And today you see the consequences that still today, white Americans are way wealthier than African Americans. I read one estimate that in Boston, Massachusetts, you think of Boston as a pretty progressive liberal place, the average wealth of an African American in Boston was $0. The average wealth of an African American family was $0. They had no money. That means you had very wealthy African Americans that still couldn't offset how many people were poor that are African American in Boston. But white Americans was over $330,000 a year. White families had $330,000 a year to zero. How do you catch up to that? How do you move forward when you're that far behind other groups in America? And that leads to other discussions where people talk about reparations or how do you fight back on this?